Okay, so can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So this talk will be about what should we expect in React and React Native ecosystem during the following year. So my name is Pavlo Babenko. Originally, I'm a web developer, so my talk about React and React Native will be from a web perspective, more from a web perspective than from native perspective. And I've been working with React Native for past 3 years, and I'm always nervous when I do public speaking. So sorry about that. So this is almost the end of the year, and the following 2019 is coming, and would be good to take an overview of what is happening in React and React Native, and what should we expect, and what should we be prepared for during the next year. Core teams for both technologies are working really hard, and they are trying to develop and create some very cool stuff. Unfortunately, there is not that much information as I wish there will be, but we can still predict something or know what to expect. So let's start with React Memo. It's needed for performant function components. As you might know, so right now if you're using class component, you can define your simple component like that, like class button extends component, all good, unless you understand that you need a little bit better performance than right now. So you will use a pure component instead of this. Pure component basically will do a shallow compare every time when the props and state will change and determine whether it should re-render your component or no, so whether it should trigger or not trigger in render action, which is pretty good for us unless you want to write a function component. So until recently, there were no option to use shallow compare in functional components, but we now have React Memo, which will do basically the same. So this code is exactly the same as this code. It's pure component, but for function components. Hey, we don't need to write class components anymore. And yes, you can use it in React Native. The following stuff is React Lazy and Suspense. This is needed for lazy loading. What lazy loading is? Imagine that you have some heavy component that you want to display. So either you have a poor network connectivity or it's really big to render, you will probably need to display something until it's loading. So you call React Lazy and wrap your heavy component into it. And then you use React Suspense to be able to use it later on. And you're providing a fallback component, like in our case it will be a loading indicator, to display something to user until this component is rendering, which is good. But you can use it in React Native, but there is no practical use for it right now. So another important stuff about Lazy and Suspense is that you can defer including your heavy component into your bundle. That means that the bundle that will be sent to the client side, to the browser, will be smaller, but there is no practical use for this in your React Native application because everything is bundled by default. However, React team is working currently on Suspense for data fetching and Suspense for server rendering. We should expect it to come in mid-2019, I hope. And while we can benefit from server rendering as React Native developers, we can use data fetching. So I do hope that it will simplify working with data in React. But we'll see. Yeah, so this is React Lazy, Suspense, React Memo. This is something that you can already use. It was shipped with React Native 16.6. And now we come to hooks. Hooks is a very interesting approach, and there are a lot of talks around this. There are people who hate hooks, people who like hooks, but nevertheless, I think that you need to know about them and potentially try to use it in your app. So hooks is another reason not to use class. In this example, you can see that we're using useState. useState is basically the same stuff that you will write regularly to be able to instantiate state in your component. So in such case, we're using useState. We're passing initial state to it, so in this case it will be false. And later on, we will get a state variable and the function to redefine the state that you can later use in your application. Why you might need it at all? So first of all, because it's smaller. Like you can see a comparison between the function components and the basic class React component that do basically the same. And you can notice the difference, I hope. Also, another cool stuff with useState is that you can pass, instead of just variable or object or array or something like basic state, you can pass a function to it, wait for execution, and then return the values that will be set to the state. Here's, by the way, an example. One of these images is an example of compiled class component, another one is example of compiled function component. I hope you can guess what is where. And a part of being smaller, that means that smaller size of your application in the end, it's easier for your code editor to lint, hint, and test flow coverage on it. useState isn't all, so there is a bunch of other hooks coming out of the box. useEffect, context, reducer, callback, memo, reference, imperative methods, and layout effects. So let's take a look at useEffect. So we called useState, and then we can call a useEffect. useEffect is basically a replacement for your component lifecycle methods. So in a basic way, once you're calling useEffect and passing some function, it will be called during the component. It will be a replacement for your component.mount function. And if you want to call something on a component will and mount, like in this case we're unsubscribing from comments, you just need to return another function for this. And if you want to make it behave like a component will update, just pass an array of parameters. So every time each of these parameters passed in array, in our case it will be a post ID, will be changed, we will re-render the effect, or recall it again. Important stuff about hooks is that each hook is called on, okay, not each hook, useState won't be called, but useEffect, for example, will be called during every render of your component, and it will be asynchronous. It might lead to some problems with performance, especially if you put some highly performance stuff into it. But there is a ways to overcome this. And also, yes, it's asynchronous, so if you want to delay component loading until useEffect will be executed, you can use useLayout effect instead. It's handy for subscribing and unsubscribing from different stuff, and once again, it's smaller compared to the regular components. Probably my favorite one is useReducer. So useReducer is basically a replacement for React Redux in some simple cases. I wouldn't consider it to be like a 100% bulletproof solution, so you shouldn't turn off your Redux and just remove it from the dependencies, but it's still very handy. So you're using it like this, you're just calling useReducer from your function component, passing a reducer and initial value to it, like initial state. This is an example reducer that you can use. You can define it in any file or anywhere in your application where you want. You can reuse it, pass it to different other useReducer functions. So this is the initial state that we're defining, and later on we can simply dispatch an action in your application. This will allow you to trigger. So basically it behaves like React Redux, if you're familiar with it, but built into React. And the coolest thing is that you can build your own React hook. So imagine that we have a feed input and comment input components, and both of them need to determine whether current user can or can't post a comment or post a feed. So to be able to do so, we're creating a function It's called check posting permission. Setting a state like can or can't post, by default it's false, so we treat every user as a not logged in user. And then during using effect, we're fetching current user permissions, setting this into the state, and returning the results that you can later on refer to in your components. What that means for us: no more higher order components, far less code in your app. Yes, you can use it in React Native, but a little bit more about this later. And it is expected to ship in first quarter of 2019, but there was so much hype driving around it, so I expect it to be shipped in January or something like that, as soon as possible, basically. After that, we can look at concurrent mode, because there is some rend components that can block main thread, and now we will be able to render these components without blocking main thread. So imagine a situation: you have a very long list and a text input with like search for this very long list in your application. And rendering of this long list is quite hard process, and it takes a lot of time to complete. So this blue line is basically the time that needs to complete the rendering of the long list. User opens this component is rendered, rendering is started for the long list, and then user event is coming. For example, user decided not to wait till the rendering will be finished and start searching for something. With current implementation in React and React Native, you won't be able to handle this event until the rendering of the long list will be finished. So this will result in a poor UI, like laggish, and it won't handle your touches properly. With a new approach, however, with concurrent mode, React is planning to render all the hard or all the complex stuff in a smaller chunks that you can stop execution at some point, add and handle user event, and then keep executing rendering of the long list. That means that we can now control what should be executed, what can be paused, and what is the main important part of your application that you want to make like 100% responsive, and what you can or shouldn't care about it. So right now, using is very simple. You just wrap your component with this unstable concurrent mode, and then you're using unstable create root to be able to render this. And both of this is not a final API. So this is completely opt-in, and as I said, it allows React to interrupt a long-running render with handling higher priority events. Also, this unstable concurrent mode will be able to handle or to skip unloading unnecessary loading screens with React Suspense, and as of now, no one knows anything about it. So it's hard to find any information, but so this is everything we have right now. We're still not sure how it will work, but when it will work, it will be very cool. Yes, in React Native, you will need to wait for Fiber first, and I will talk more about Fiber later on. Yeah, bulletproof solution for all your hard work in React application. It is expected to ship in the second quarter of 2019, and personally, I'm waiting for it. I'm not sure about you. Moving forward, Fragment. Fragment is like my last part about React, and this is something that was introduced pretty long ago, and turns out that not all developers knows about it. So with Fragment, there is no need to create additional element on your view hierarchy. Without it, so like if you're trying to render some text and buttons and you don't care about layout on top of them, if you will try to render something like this, you will get a red screen of death saying that you need to wrap everything into JSX fragment. So usually you wrap it into view. It doesn't have any properties. It doesn't do anything to styling. It just wraps your components to be able to make React not complaining about it. And every time you wrap something in a view that you actually don't use in your application, it creates another view node in the rendering hierarchy and make it less performant, especially on Android. But with Fragment, you don't need to use view anymore. It won't create a node in your view, and it just allows you to render a text, button, and all that stuff. It was shipped, by the way, like a year ago, and still people don't know about it. Yeah, so it's cool, but we're here to talk about React Native. And the first stuff, yes, it's React Native hooks. So open source community around React Native come up with this library with a lot of basic hooks, like basic APIs from React Native wrapped into hooks, like accessibility info, clipboard, camera roll, and so on. And you can't use it right now. You will need to use React Next version and React Native Next version. But right now it's very easy to set up your project to be able to use hooks, and I highly recommend you to play with it. So now we're coming to the fantastic stuff that is coming to React Native, actually. The Fabric that I mentioned before, GSI, and Turbo modules. So what GSI is? JavaScript. A GSI is basically a new JavaScript interface. So as you may know, right now React Native works in this way. So there's three main threads. A JavaScript thread, a shadow thread that is basically a yoga written in C++, and a native thread that either is Swift or Java or Objective-C code that actually interacts with your platform. There is a huge bridge between JavaScript and shadow tree. That means that all the communication between both of them will be done in JSON. That's in serialized JSON. That's the only way to pass data between them. And it's not that performant, as we all know. So every time when you listen to talk about React Native performance, the JavaScript bridge is the main pain point for everyone. And here you can compare how it looks or how it works in a browser. So in a browser, there's no such thing as a bridge, and instead your JavaScript will just call a reference to the browser built-in function that will describe everything. So in such case, this is a browser HTML input that is a checkbox. It has a set of properties that it needs to pass to the native API, the platform native API. In this case, it's Windows checkbox. And people at React Native decided that they can do the same, but with React Native. So instead of having a huge bridge, there will be a shadow thread written in C++, having all the properties and methods exposed to the JavaScript. And instead, JavaScript will hold references to these objects in C++, because communication between C++ and native platform API will be much faster than communication between JavaScript and C++. So imagine this is how it worked before. Imagine that you have a camera module, native, and uploader module, also native. So you're taking a picture with a camera module, then this picture will be serialized into JSON, passed into JavaScript through the through the bridge, and then from the JavaScript you will pass the same picture deserialized, then serialized again with the bridge back to native module that will be responsible for handling upload. So passing the same thing twice, especially if it's quite a big thing, isn't the best solution for performance. And with new implementation with GSI, it is expected that there will be a C++ implementation for your native module, and you will pass only a reference of this picture to the JavaScript that will later on be passed to the native component. That means that the actual file or the actual picture won't be passed twice. It won't be passed at all through the bridge. It will just communicate between native modules, which is very interesting, as for me. So turbo modules and other stuff is a C++ implementation for native modules. You can basically see anything, but you can imagine that there is a C++ implementation for camera module that just responsible for exposing API to JavaScript side and calling the native side API. This is the stuff that React Native team is planning to write a lot of native modules with it. And I will talk about this at the end again. But we're coming to Fabric. Fabric is a UI layer re-architecture. So as of today, every change on every of the threads will be passed backwards. So the problem with current implementation of the bridge is that, first of all, you can't block JavaScript on the main thread. That creates some problems to gesture responder system. You also can't synchronize layout between frameworks because layouts are actually computed in the shadow thread. There is a problem with lifecycle of each native modules because the lifecycle of them is tied to the bridge. And the more importantly, JavaScript is blocked on native initialization. Every time a new manager initialized or native module initialized, your JavaScript thread is basically blocked. With the changes to this, they're expecting to, first of all, switch to synchronous React mode for rendering. Second, they're expecting to have immutable shadow nodes. So that means that JavaScript will do all the calculations, pass the properties, and shadow modes won't be mutated. They will be responsible just for passing the props. And this will allow us to recompute layout on any of these threads, which should, in theory, make our application more performant. Another thing that is coming to these UI changes is view flattening. So currently, when you render something with React Native, it generally generates a lot of layout nodes. This is something that we were talking about with Fragment. So every time when you render a view, it creates a node, no matter whether you actually need this node or not. And we can get rid of this by removing layout-only views. So this is an example. At the top, there is a current situation, a lot of small views that are not actually used or visible to the user. And with view flattening, we should be able to get rid of them and leave only the stuff that is visible or changeable to the user. So layout-only views is something that passes all these checks. So it's a pure view. There is no associated event listeners, no associated native ID. It's not accessible. There is no overflow. It's full opacity, no background color, no transform, no shadow, no z-index. So not all views basically fulfills all these needs, but the ones that do, by removing them, we can provide a smaller memory consumption to our application. We can generate an easier view hierarchy that will be easier to navigate every time when you open React Native debugger. And we hope that it should work faster. Yes, and the last part of this dramatic changes to React Native world is extracting some of the core React Native modules into its own repositories. So this is an example. In version 0.58, they'll probably get rid from React Native Web View at all, so it will be extracted into its own separate module. They're also dropping Navigator iOS because no one uses it. And they're planning to do this with other modules that are tied to the core of React Native. There's a lot of reasons for this, actually. First of all, they can't manage to provide the support for all of them. It's hard to fulfill or close the pull requests from the community. It's much easier to manage them or to provide management of these modules to the community instead of doing this with the small React Native core team. And another benefit for us in such situation is that you don't always need all the modules that are coming with React Native, so you can get rid of them and it will result in a smaller bundle in your application. Yes. Small bonus, so remember Expo? Expo is a tool that everyone is using to create React Native to the applications and run it in their phones, then close it, switch to React Native in it, and build actual project. Turns out that there are some developers that hope that Expo is actually React Native, but it's not in case of. So turns out that Expo team has built a lot of native modules, very cool native modules, but with their current ecosystem, it's very hard to remove them from the expo itself and provide it to the community. So right now they're planning to change this. They're planning to make their system more open to the outer world, easier to work with, and the most important part for us, they're trying to get all these native modules, write a C++ implementation on top of them, and provide them to the community. They do expect that you will be able, as React Native developers, you will be able to benefit of this. But another thing that is coming is that they do expect to be able to share these native modules with other platforms like NativeScript, Flutter, or Ionic. Basically the same thing that is React Native team trying to do. So I would expect that Flutter and even Cordova application will be much more popular during the next year because it will be easier to use or to reuse something that was already written for React Native, which we didn't have as React Native developers before when we started to work with, because it was almost impossible to port Cordova modules into React Native world. So yeah, that's all from me. Don't forget to watch a conference tomorrow. There is a ByteConf conference. It's a very new conf. It's free, open source, streamed by Twitch, so you can just open your computer at any time and take a look at what's happening in React Native. Yeah, any questions?
Thank you so much for your conference. It's really great that you are a master in your sphere. And my question is, how to, like a code newbie in this sphere, how to keep on track, because React Native is changing over and over again. And a month ago it was a new one, but now it's not used. How to keep in a track?
So as a code newbie, the first thing that you actually need to do, you need to develop some confidence in what you already have. So you don't need to look at what's happening in React Native. You don't need to plan at what will be there in a month or so. You just need to become very familiar with the tools that you have. So, example, you're using React Native 0.57. You read the documentation, try to build some application on top of this. Get familiar with ecosystem in general. And later on you can, whoa, there's a lot of ways. So you can subscribe to React Native newsletter. Here and there, so they usually send a newsletter once in a few weeks or anytime when something important is happening. You can find, there's around 20 people in React Native community who are actively tweeting and providing some updates on what's happening in this community. So you can follow them in Twitter and keep on track with it. But basically, there's no need to know everything, and there's no need to always live on the edge, especially if you're a newbie. You just need to make yourself comfortable working with the tools that already exist. So there's a very important rule. So despite the fact that there's an open source community, there's a lot of good stuff happening there. The very important rule there is that if you're asking a question or asking for help, if another person, instead of helping you with this question, just saying you just need to use a new version, fuck them, you know, like, because it doesn't work like that. There should be a solution, or if it won't be, then you probably will spend months or something like that trying to figure out, and if no, then you can try to use a new version. But like React Native, so React Navigation version 3 came out like less than a month ago, if I'm right, or something like that. So it's still new. The API has changed. You don't need to upgrade your project there. Um, we have so we're working on a project for 3 years. We have pretty outdated React Native version. We have a very outdated React navigation version, which doesn't block us from shipping our code and doing a great job.
I have two small questions. First, I want to say thank you for such a great speak. And first question is about React fragments. And I know that you can use just empty tag instead of using React fragments. And how
Yes.
do you think, is it good way?
I think it makes code more readable. So because empty tags, I don't know. So it's just a personal preference. I decided to talk about React fragment because I've seen it from my fellow developer in the team, and turns out that rest of the team. So I've done the same talk today for my team. Turns out the rest of the team wasn't using fragment, despite the fact that it was introduced a year ago, and they didn't even knew that you can use an empty tag. So this is something that you can be aware. You can use it or not. It's your decision.
Okay, and second question is about everything that you talked here about new things that's coming in 19 year. And I want to ask you, did you use all these things already? But it looks like you know everything about this. And are there some group of coders and Weeks, for example, who are using it already and are ready to use it when it's come up?
Okay, so first of all, I'm not working at Wix.
Okay.
So this is more a question to Lev than to me. I'm pretty sure that there is almost no person. Okay, there might be few that are using all this stuff right now, because it's still in a draft state. There is around 10 to 20 persons who are very interested in React Native ecosystem in general, and they're trying to use it in their pet projects or maybe in production projects. We're not using all this at all, and I doubt that we will start using it anytime soon, because like we have a huge technical debt that we need to support, and it's always hard to switch to new versions. But we will try, definitely. So once everything will be shipped, and we will wait for a few weeks, maybe a month, to get enough responses in Stack Overflow for everything that is not working. And after that, we will try to implement it in our system.
Okay, thank you.
I'll answer about Wix. We are not chasing about for the newest stuff. For example, we're just now updating for the React Native 57. And we are more driven by problems. When we have problem and we need to find a solution, and if the new version of some library is giving us the solution, then we try to update and understand how they solved it. In general, this is what we do.
Nothing. Okay, so this is more a question about hooks in general, as I understand. I was introduced to hooks by my fellow coworker a month ago. He created a good demonstration for this with live coding and examples and so on, and I wasn't convinced. Like, okay, yeah, it works, but what for? When I was working on this presentation, I tend to like them more. I think hooks and function components in general are very handy when you're trying to write something simple, or maybe something with medium complexity. But there are definitely the cases where class components is still the first class citizen. And so I don't have anything against classes, just for reference. It's just another way of writing your code that might be cleaner or might be clearer And it, in general, it might be easier to organize your code with functions instead of with classes, because sometimes my classes got very big and it's very hard to navigate. This is more my problem than the class problem.
More questions?
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Few stuff that I want to say in the end. First of all, we have cocktails and bar at the center of the office. Second, I want to remind you, join the meetup group because our next session will be probably on performance or architecture, because there are lots of questions about how we do architecture end to end with the continuous integration and everything. And that's all. And we are always looking for new people to join our team. And you are all welcome to send us, to talk to me, send me CV, everything, and have fun.